Is it just me, or is French cuisine kinda weird?
I thought I'd try somewhere in town. Anywhere you recommend? Well, what sort of food are you thinking of? Anywhere they do French food? Yes, France, I believe. They seem to like it,
France is world famous for its cuisine, so just about anything's gonna be great.
When you think of French cuisine, you probably think of a glass of wine with a baguette, and some mime in the corner with the Eiffel Tower. But this isn't cuisine. This is like a travel ad. Let me show you some very common, everyday French food. Steak frites, omelette au fromage, pot-au-feu. This is what French people normally eat, but for most of us, this isn't what we imagine when we think about French food. To many of us, French cuisine is classy.
God, I love this cafe. I wish they had places like this in the US.
Romantic.
Un pain au chocolat.
Smart.
It's supposed to be one of the best French places in town.
I did not realize that you were so cultured.
I mean, why does it have this image, this appeal?
Un livre de cuisine français.
This doesn't just happen. The world doesn't just wake up one day and pick a country like Canada and start romanticizing its culture. When you think of other cuisines, like say Italian and Japanese for example, you think of the food, sushi, pasta, etc. But when it comes to French cuisine, it's more about the idea than any one particular dish. I mean, I've been to France, I've had French food, and besides bread, I can't really put a name to what I ate. All I remember is that it was pretty good, and it made me feel kinda sophisticated for whatever reason. So I wanna know why. Why do I romanticize this abstract idea of French cuisine, where food feels more like a privilege than a right? I want to know, why is French food fancy? Turns out, it wasn't always this way. Other European countries used to actually look down on French food. Queen Catherine of France, who was originally from Italy, even brought Italian cooks with her, just because she thought French food wasn't good enough. Now, I'm not saying that French food was bad all across the board, it wasn't, but it was far behind its neighbors in innovation and use of ingredients. So how do we get from here to here?
The cuisine is not an old, tired marriage. It is a passionate affair.
Well, there's a lot of points in this story that I can start from, but I'm gonna start with this guy, Louis XIV. He was the king of France and is probably gonna be the most influential person I'm gonna talk about today. Just to give you an idea of how he changed France, here's some of his predecessors, previous kings. And then here's Louis XIV and his successors. Louis XIV became king at the age of 5. Yeah, monarchies. To be fair, he was king, but he wasn't really ruling the country yet because he was a toddler. There was a regency that sort of temporarily took control, and it was at this point where the nobility of France, the rich class that's not part of the monarchy, saw an opportunity. Not long after Louis XIV ascended to the throne, a series of civil wars broke out. These wars were fought between the nobility and monarchy of France. The contents of the war aren't really that important. It was about who could control the country. And it ended up with Louis XIV coming out on top. But this whole experience left a scar on this guy. I mean, he grew up through wars literally against his existence. He never wanted something like this to happen again. And to make sure of that, he needed to change how France worked. Back then, power in France was divided by feudal lords and monarchy. It was kind of all over the place. I mean, there weren't even standard rules to the French language yet. Louis saw this as the core of the problem. The king didn't have the absolute divine power we think of them having today, but Louis wanted that, so he got rid of the feudal system and built one of the most luxurious buildings in the world. By the way, the Palace of Versailles isn't just this big fancy building that rich people used to live in. I mean, this building is part of the reason why we have these today. And the excess this building represented would ultimately lead to... yeah, we'll get to that. Anyways, this palace was where Louis XIV would model something we now call a centralized government. That meant that there weren't going to be any more feudal lords that were just going to be running different parts of the country. Instead, all of the governing of France was going to happen in this one building. And because the building was so nice, it was pretty easy for Louis to goad the monarchy and the aristocracy to move there. But, you know, there was a weakness he had to consider. Louis XIV had put the most powerful people in France in one place, so he could control them and the country more easily. But he also put himself at risk of all of these people easily being able to conspire against him since they were now all in the same place. To make sure none of these people would try to revolt against him, he didn't turn to guns, but instead this. Louis XIV invested a lot into art, in the name of elevating French culture. You can see how crazy and out of control they went with this, just look at Versailles. Throughout the years, they just kept on building on top of it to make it more extravagant. By the way, this wasn't happening because France was going through some sort of economic miracle. In order to pay for all of this, Louis XIV had to raise taxes on the poor and borrow money. Doing this for years and years obviously started straining the French economy. But, you know, it didn't matter because French culture started looking like this. Art distracted the upper class, who were throwing money at the stuff. This art also made Louis XIV look like a god-chosen king. One of the most important mediums he invested into was cuisine. Banquets were a big part of Louis XIV's lifestyle. There's accounts that he often ate 4 plates of soup, a whole pheasant, salad, and a bunch of other stuff in one meal. Also, Louis XIV would invite diplomats and leaders from other European countries to sort of show off how cultured France was becoming at the time. Turns out, if your culture is hip and other countries like you, they're more likely to listen to you. This is, you know, what we call soft power today, and France is still pretty good at it.
Santé, santé.
This was all happening at the right moment, because at the same time, this guy was about to change French cuisine forever. Remember, before Louis XIV, France was a pretty feudal country, meaning that French cuisine didn't really exist, at least not in the way that we think of it today. Each region kind of had its own different style of cooking, which was still all kind of medieval, by the way. Francois would write a cookbook to change all of this, to make French cuisine consistent and give it a proper image. He didn't only record recipes from places all across France, by the way. He also made certain rules that every French cook should follow. This is what we call codifying cuisine. It's a minimum standard of cooking to keep a cuisine consistent. I know this pretty much sounds like common sense to us today, but it wasn't back then. Oh, also Francois got cooks to replace expensive foreign spices like saffron and ginger with more local ones like parsley and thyme to keep French cuisine dependent on itself. And he's also the one who got France into butter, which is kind of a pretty big deal. So these two key moments, Louis XIV consolidating power in Versailles and Francois codifying French cuisine, led to an explosion of this. Haute cuisine, or French high-end cuisine, had existed for a while already. But this is where it kicked off into the food that we recognize today. And it didn't stop after Louis XIV. The monarchy kept this up. Even though it was costing France a lot of money, it didn't really have. But this was now a new generation, and these people were raised by these riches, and they weren't gonna stop. In order to finance this lifestyle, they constantly continued to increase taxes, which of course hurt the poorest in France the most. And in 1789, okay, I'm not gonna unpack the French Revolution, that's too much of a tangent, but I'm mentioning it because it's one of the major reasons to why we have this. After the French got rid of the monarchy and nobility, simply put, a lot of chefs were out of a job. And these were the chefs who were trained to cook some of the best food in the world. The ones who didn't get chopped needed to find a way to make a new living. And one thing to add is that these chefs weren't just trained to cook really good food. They were also trained to learn a lot about luxuries that weren't really available to the public back then. Stuff like porcelain, wine selections, or chandeliers even. Public dining wasn't really like what it is today. At least in the West, most public dining spaces were usually these dingy taverns or places people would call ordinaries. They had a small fixed menu, if there was a menu at all, and their main purpose was to really just feed you. It wasn't really about eating really good food, it was just about being fed in general. And they didn't have a lot of luxuries that we take for granted today. Like back then, in order to dine in one of these places, you had to bring your own cutlery. But it was the 1700s, and a new class of people was beginning to appear. A lot of normal people were beginning to be able to afford a little bit extra in their lives, and the chefs who were suddenly out of a job needed to invent a new one. They opened up these new dining spaces, but they weren't just designed to feed you. No, these weren't some dingy taverns or ordinaries. These were restaurants. They were designed to be beautiful, ornate, and for a short amount of time, you could live like a noble or a king. These places had waiters who were dressed up and would serve you your orders. Oh yeah, speaking of ordering, these places had menus, like pages and pages of options. And on top of that, a menu for wine? Basically, France was the first country to introduce this modern style of dining, the style of dining that we now all have today. After all, the word restaurant is French, menu is French, entrée is French. By the way, does anyone know why we use the word entree for main dish in America? I mean, the word literally means entrance or starters. I get that we're Americans and whatnot, but like, genuinely, how did something like that happen? Like, I actually want to know, like, how did we do that? Like, why? Anyways, this all happened at the right time once again, because the world was beginning to globalize, and people were now becoming connected, and they could travel to France and kind of discover what France was doing with their restaurants, bistros, and cafes. I mean, everyone wanted to imitate it, which is why this style of dining doesn't just exist in France anymore, but literally everywhere. I think this is why when we think about French cuisine, we don't think about tahine, confit, or galette. We think about the aesthetic, the idea, the romance. In France, the experience of eating is sometimes more important than the food itself. And it's because of this that I think France has sort of become a victim of their own success. French restaurants have sort of pushed this idea that they produce works of art, these beautiful, amazing looking dishes, which usually are actually really, really amazing for sure. But the thing is, nobody knows what they're called.
We'll have the
I think this is why French food has sort of fallen off recently. It was once the king of cuisines, but now it has to compete with like Mexican and Korean food. The globalization that helped French cuisine thrive is now the same force that's choking it. People aren't going to restaurants in Paris because of the food anymore. They're going for this abstract ideal of being cultured and sophisticated. And let's be honest, most people only order ratatouille because of the movie. Like, I honestly don't even think most people know what it is. I wanted to tell the story because it shows that no matter how strong an idea becomes, nothing stays static. French dining is an art form, and it's still influential today. But as other cuisines catch up, I'm not sure how much longer French food can stay as an idea, before it just becomes food.